Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm really glad that I can be here. And my part of this workshop is about conservation and risk assessment. I'm a conservator and art historian from Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology. And my job here is to supervise conservation works at archaeological sites. I spent a few years, a few seasons in Old Dongola also. It will be also a part of this presentation. Mm. Uh, And the structure of the lecture moves from a general concept to a practical application. First, we will define a conservation and establish a short terminology. Then we will discuss excavation itself as a conservation risk. After that, we will look at the materials and deterioration process relevant to Sudanese archaeological sites. Only after this foundation we will move to preventive conservation and risk assessment. This is important because risk assessment should not be treated as a separate administrative tool. It has to emerge from an understanding of materials, values, exposure, deterioration process, and let's say that realistic management capacity. And the lecture ends with Old Dongola, not as an isolated example, but as a case study showing how all these issues comes together in one complex archaeological landscape. Mm. And I would like to start from a fundamental question. What do we actually mean when we speak about conservation at archaeological sites? This is important because archaeologists, architects, and conservators often use the same terms differently. At archaeological sites, especially in Sudanese contexts, conservation is not limited to restoration or treatment. It's broader process involving excavation strategy, documentation, stabilization, also environmental understanding, maintenance, and what is really important, long-term management. So the aim of this section is therefore to establish a short framework before moving to deterioration process and risk assessment. So the central principle in a modern archaeological conservation is that archaeology, conservation cannot be separated. Because excavation is not a neutral activity. The moment we excavate, we transform the archaeological contexts. Before excavation, these buried architecture and objects exist within a quite, not always, but quite stable environment. But when exposed, they become vulnerable to rapid deterioration caused of fluctuation, salts, even wind erosion, thermal stress, also sometimes biological activity, and some structural instability. This means conservation cannot begin only after excavation is completed. It must already be a part of this excavation planning. And documentation here is uh, equally critical. Every intervention, excavation included, modifies evidence. So a poor documentation therefore becomes a form or a loss. That's right. I'm happy that during this workshop you will know a lot of phases of documentation from conservation point of view, but not only also view of modern technologies, which is really important right now. At archaeological sites, conservation is directly connected to research quality. Um, if preservation fails, interpretation also become limited. Mm, Also, it's important to define what conservation means in heritage practice. Today, conservation is understood as a really multidisciplinary field focused on safeguarding cultural heritage and managing it long-term survival. Importantly, conservation is not limited to this repair or restoration. It includes research documentation, scientific analysis, preventive action, some stabilization, also really important monitoring, and management aspects. This modern conservation theory is based on the understanding the cultural heritage is changing through time. Materials deteriorate, environments change, and sites continue to evolve after excavation. In this case, conservation is not attempt to freeze heritage in an ideal state. Instead, it's a process of understanding and managing change while preserving authenticity, historical evidence, and cultural significance. Another important point is that conservation concerns not only the physical material itself, but also the meaning and values associated with this heritage. And to these values, we will come back. That's right. It's really important also that you had the one lecture before this lecture about values of earthen architecture. This broader understanding is particularly important at archaeological sites where context stratigraphy and a relationship between materials are often as significant as the object or structures itself. And modern conservation theory developed mainly during the 19th and 20th century. I will tell about it only few words, more that you can see how it changed in time. One of the most influential figures was John Ruskin, who strongly opposed reconstruction and emphasized the importance of preserving original material and the authenticity of aging structures. For example, for Ruskin, traces of time were part of the monument's value. And a bit different position was represented by Viollet-le-Duc, who understand restoration as the possibility of returning a monument to a complete and coherent form, and sometimes even reconstructing elements that never exist exactly in that state. And later, Alois Riegel introduced the idea that heritage process multiply values. So this historical, age, cultural, artistic values, etc. And this became extremely important for modern heritage management. contemporary conservation theory developed from these debates and gradually shift to principles such as minimum intervention, respect for authenticity, scientific documentation, and compatibility of materials and preventive conservation. And here you have several international documents, but also later with a presentation, I will send you a file with some additional materials and some important websites about risk assessment and conservation principles. Over the last decade, conservation practice really has changed. Earlier approaches often focused mainly on restoring monuments or repairing visible damage. Contemporary conservation is much broader, uh, management oriented. Today, conservation includes preventive conservation, environmental monitoring, maintenance system, also risk assessment, documentation strategies, and long-term planning. And another important change is the understanding that heritage should not be treated as a static object. Archaeological sites are really dynamic system affected by all of these environmental conditions, also tourism, excavation itself, climate, and social use. And because of this, deterioration is understood as a process that cannot always be completely stopped. Uh, Instead, the conservation aims to understand, monitor, slow, and manage deterioration in a ways that minimize the loss of this heritage value. Some terminology should be clearly here, and you have just really base term in, so it's a conservation, restoration, stabilization, also preventive conservation, maintenance, reconstruction, and anastylosis. But also, I will send you some dictionary about a conservation process. And one of the central principles in archaeological conservation is conservation in situ, preserving heritage in its original location and context. Archaeological value does not exist only in isolated objects, but also in relationships between structures, layers, surfaces, and landscape. Removing materials from context often results in loss of information. However, conservation in situ is also highly challenging. Once exposed, archaeological remains become really vulnerable to environmental and this structural deterioration. And this is especially important in a Sudanese contexts where exposed earthen architecture and plaster often require continuous maintenance and environmental management. Excavation therefore become an irreversible intervention that fundamentally change this preservation condition. And this archaeological conservation differs from many other conservation fields because um, mm, uh, because this excavation fundamentally change preservation conditions. Um, like I said before excavation, these buried remains often exist in relatively stable environmental conditions, and when exposed, they are immediately become vulnerable for fluctuation, salts, erosion, structural instability, and also a thermal stress. Mm, And another important issue is that conservation decisions directly influence archaeological interpretation. So cleaning, reconstruction, stabilization, or a replacement may change how structures and surfaces are understood and presented. For this reason, archaeological conservation is include much more than treatment alone. It involves also excavation planning, temporary stabilization during field work, this environmental protection, documentation protocols, which are really important, and once again, long-term management strategy. Mm, and this is particularly relevant in a Sudanese archaeological context, where earthen architecture and exposed architectural remains often require continuous maintenance and preventive conservation after excavations. From this point, we can now move to deterioration process and risk assessment, because these are direct consequences of exposure and long-term site vulnerability. The relationship between excavation, documentation, and conservation planning, it's really fundamental. Excavation produced archaeological knowledge, but it also change or remove the original contexts. Therefore, documentation is not a secondary task here. It is a part of all conservation process, and this conservation planning should begin before excavation, because decision made during excavation determine what will be exposed for how long, under what condition, and with what protection. So these conservation decisions also affect future interpretation. So this stabilization, cleaning, consolidation, sometimes reconstruction or covering may change how remains are understood later. And this brings us directly to the second section of this lecture. So excavation itself as a conservation risk. The main argument of this section is that excavation is not only research activity, it's also conservation event. Archaeological materials often survive because they have been buried. When excavation exposed them, then this condition change immediately. And materials that were stable underground may become unstable after exposure. After excavation, materials are exposed to new environmental forces. Uh, Moisture fluctuation are particularly important. Wetting and drying cycle can cause swelling, shrinkage, salt crystallization, also cracking and loss of cohesion. Also, salt maybe become active when moisture moves through porous materials. As the water evaporates, salts crystallizate and generate a pressure within pores or at surfaces. And also, this thermal stress can affect exposed surfaces, especially where daily temperature variation are high. And this is the case of Sudan also. Also, oxidation process may accelerate in the metal and organic materials after exposure to oxygen. Um, so some risks are not simply natural also, they are created directly by excavation practice and incomplete documentation in one of the most serious risks because excavation is irreversible if information are not recorded before a removal or change. Uh, it means that they are lost. Removal of deposit may also remove physical support for walls, plaster, or floor sometimes. Fragile remains may be exposed without a temporary protection. It's also a problem during archaeological works. In some cases, deterioration accelerates during the campaign itself. Surface dry too quickly, salts appear, plaster edges detach, or walls crack or collapse. A common problem is that excavation exposes material without a realistic plan for what will happen after the season ends. And this is especially dangerous for open air archaeological sites. Mm, so, conservation during excavation is not limited to final treatment, and it begins with planning. So important is identifying fragile materials, identify risks, and defining response and procedures. First aid conservation may include temporary support, protection of edges, controlled drying, safe lifting, also emergency packing or temporary sheltering. This temporary stabilization may be necessary also for walls, plaster fragments, painted surfaces, or fragile deposits. And here really documentational protocols are essential. Every intervention should be recorded. Coordination between archaeologists and conservators is really critical here. Conservation decisions must support archaeological interpretation, while archaeological strategy must take material vulnerability into account. Mm. And some interventions are intended to protect heritage, but actually increase deterioration. So the most important, I think, are cement repairs. This is a frequent example. They may be too hard to mm, because of chemical process impermeable to historic materials, and they can trap moisture and salts or redirect deterioration into original fabric. This incompatible mortars can create mechanical problems also. Uh, Also, uncontrolled reconstruction may obscure evidence or create misleading interpretation. Mm, Sealing surfaces without understanding major movement can accelerate salt damage, and also lack of drainage planning is especially dangerous at open air sites. The most important point is that conservation must address causes, not only symptoms. So, if the cause of damage is water, salt, instability, or lack of maintenance, cosmetic treatment alone will fail. Yeah. We have established that excavation change environmental and structural conditions. The next step is to ask how different materials respond to these changes. Mm, This section focuses on the materials and deterioration process relevant to archaeological sites in Sudan. The aim is not to provide a complete material science lecture, but to show how different materials respond to exposure and how these responses create a conservation risks. The main groups discussed here are earthen architecture and mud-based materials, but also mud, but also lime plasters and wall paintings, stone and brick architecture, and excavated archaeological assemblage. Across all these categories, several pressure recur: salts, wind, rain, thermal stress, biological activity, and the lack of continuous maintenance. This earthen architecture is one of the most important material categories. It includes mud brick, mud mortars, earthen plasters, and materials containing organic tempers such as straw or turf. These materials can be highly durable when maintained within traditional cycle or repair and protection. However, after excavation and abandoned, their vulnerability increasingly sharply. The main weakness is not simply that earthen is fragile. The problem is that these earthen materials require environmental understanding and regular maintenance. Water, salt, also wind erosion, and loss of protective surface can quickly transform minor damage into a structural factor. Mm, Earthen materials deteriorate through several connected mechanisms. Rain erosion can wash away surfaces, round edges, and undercut walls. A capillary measure moves upward through porous materials, transporting salts. This salt crystallization can cause surface powdering, granule disintegration and detachment, and drying shrinkage may lead to cracking, especially when materials have been newly exposed or where repair materials behave differently from original fabric. Wind erosion also can gradually remove losses parties less, especially from unprotected surface, and also wall tops and wall bases are particularly vulnerable. Wall tops receive direct rain and solar exposure, while wall bases are affected by water runoff, capillary moisture, and erosion. In these Sudanese contexts, earthen materials are affected by seasonal and logistical factors. Seasonal rainfall may be briefly but destructive, especially when water concentrates in trenches, wall bases, or poor drainage area. Flash floods can cause rapid erosion and structural damage. Long dry season contribute to shrinkage, salt accumulation, and surface fragility. And these high thermal amplitudes may stress exposed surfaces. Mm, Also, wind and sand abrasion affect unprotected materials, and the key issue is interruption in maintenance. Traditional earthen architecture can survive through repeated care, but archaeological sites often lack this continuous maintenance cycle. This makes preventive conservation and seasonal planning essential. And here you have a scheme for Old Dongola about analysis of climate hazards. And we decided that right now for Old Dongola, the most difficult is this cycle, heavy rainfall, really strong, not so often, but really strong. And after that, drought, because it make this earthen architecture exposed for thermal stress. We have also mud and lime plaster with wall paintings, for example, in a case of Dongola, and they must be understood as a layered system rather than isolated surfaces. So they consist of a substrate, plaster layers, preparatory layers, paint layers, and often later modification, uh, such as whitewashes or repairs. And their condition depends on the relation between all these layers and the stability of supporting wall. Multi-phase surfaces are particularly important because they preserve historical and technological sequence that are part of the archaeological evidence. Moisture and salts are among the main deterioration factors. They may cause a powdering, flaking, pigment instability, also detachment, delamination, and loss of cohesion. And these repeating wetting and drying cycles accelerate this process, especially in exposed archaeological contexts. Stoned and fired brick and also mud brick may appear more durable than stone brick and fired brick may appear more durable than earthen materials, but they also deteriorate when exposed. Mortar lose weakness the structural connection between masonry units. Wall bases may erode because of water runoff or capillary moisture, and structural cracking and deformation may develop when excavation removes support of this exposed foundation. What make an effect collapse often result from combined factors, a loss of mortar, moisture, erosion, also vegetation, structural imbalance, and a lack of maintenance. And excavation trenches can create drainage problems also, uh, mm, concentrating water around foundation or wall bases. Therefore, architectural conservation requires both material assessment and structural understanding. And this archaeological assemblage also requires conservation planning, so-called small finds. Ceramic may be robust, but they can contain salt or fragile surfaces. Metal may corrode rapidly after excavation because exposure change oxygen and humidity conditions. Also, glass can be unstable depending on composition. And also, organic materials, when preserved, are often highly vulnerable to drying, deformation, and some biological deterioration. Storage conditions during and after excavation are really critical here. And the major point is that context loss is also conservation loss. If objects are separated from documentation, stratigraphy, or associated materials, their research value is reduced even if the object physically survives. Deterioration processes are interconnected. Moisture is often a central driver because it's activated salts, biological growth, erosion, and material movement. Salt crystallization can damage plasters, masonry, mud brick, and painted surfaces. Erosion removes protective layers and exposed new surfaces, and structural instability accelerates loss of material, and material deterioration can create a structural instability. This poor maintenance allows small problems to become major failures. This systematic character leads directly to preventive conservation. If deterioration is connected, then conservation must be also organized as a system. And conservation practice has increasingly shift from isolated intervention to preventive conservation. This do not mean that treatment is unnecessary, of course. Stabilization and remedial conservation are often essential. However, at archaeological sites, repeated treatment without maintenance and monitoring is usually unstable. If the causes of deterioration remain active, intervention will fail or need constant repetition. Preventive conservation focuses on reducing risk, monitoring change, and establish system of care. And the preventive conservation framework includes several practical components, which are regular inspection help identify problems before they become severe. Environmental monitoring records conditions such as humidity, temperature, water flow, or exposure patterns. Maintenance planning defines what needs to be checked when and by whom. Photographic monitoring allows comparison over time, and seasonal protection may include coverings, shelter, drainage, backfilling, or temporary barriers. Mm, Vegetation management is important where roots destabilize structure or trap moisture. And this emergency response planning prepares the team of sudden events such as floods or structural collapse. Mm, And I would like to present you a really nice illustrated glossary with a catalog of damage it made by Museum of Islamic Art, I think, in Berlin. And I will send you, I want to show you only 2 pages that you could see how it works. So we have here Arabic and English translation into different um, degradation and deterioration aspects. Mm. Preventive and corrective conservation are both part of heritage care, of course, but they operate differently. Mm, Preventive conservation acts before major damage occurs. It tries to reduce the conditions and produce deterioration, and the corrective conservation responds to visible damage. It may involve stabilization, consolidation, repair, and treatment. At archaeological sites, these two must work together. Mm. Maintenance is sometimes seen as less important than restoration, but in archaeological site conservation, it is fundamental. Many severe failure begin as a small defect, a blocked drainage channel, a crack, a damaged shelter, a loose plaster, edge, eroded wall, top, or vegetation grown. If there are addressed early, large-scale damage may be prevented. Maintenance also creates continuity between excavation seasons. This culture means assigning responsibility, creating simple inspection routines, and ensuring that conservation is not limited to occasional campaigns. Mm, Many conservation problems are not only technical, they are organizational. Responsibilities may be fragmented between excavation teams, local authorities, international missions, conservators, architects, and site guards. Funding may support excavation or major restoration, but for example, not routine maintenance. Local maintenance structure may be absent or under reconstructed. Documentation may be produced but not updated or integrated into decision making. Also, personnel may change between the seasons, causing loss of knowledge. And these organizational issues directly also affect physical preservation. Mm. And this long-term conservation cannot depend only on external missions, of course. So local communities often have a knowledge of climate, materials, access roads, seasonal events, and traditional maintenance practices. And this training and capacity building are essential here, and conservation strategies must be realistic for the people who will actually maintain the site. So this community involvement is not only kind of social addition, it's a conservation necessary when heritage is exposed to a continuous environmental and human pressure. Mm. And now we will go to risk assessment. Uh, This risk assessment has become one of the central methodologies in a contemporary preventive conservation. Organizations such as ICROM, Getty Conservation Institute, the Canadian Conservation Institute increasingly approach conservation not only through treatment of individual objects, but through management of risk affecting collections, building, and also archaeological sites. Mm, the key idea is that conservation resources are always limited. We therefore need methods that help identify what is most vulnerable, what is deterioration fasters, and where intervention will have the greatest effect. So risk assessment is a structured process connecting material analysis, deterioration process, significance assessment, and management realities. Importantly, heritage risk assessment differs from engineering or insurance risk assessment because the consequence is not only physical damage, the consequence is loss of heritage value. A crack in a modern wall and a crack in a medieval paint surface do not have the same meaning. This is why heritage value must always remain as central to assessment process. This risk-based conservation developed gradually during the late 20th century as a conservation professionals recognized that reactive intervention alone was not sustainable. Conservation increasingly shift from isolated treatment to management-oriented approaches. This shift was especially important for archaeological sites, historic cities, and large collections where complete treatments of every element is impossible. And here you have some programs. For example, ICROM and Getty approaches increasingly emphasize preventive conservation, maintenance system monitoring, values-based management, and sustainability. The Canadian Conservation Institute developed one of the most influential risk assessment methodologies, especially for a collection based on probability and magnitude of loss. At archaeological sites, this idea evolved into landscape scale and site scale risk management. And the risk assessment is therefore part of a broader transition from restoration-focused conservation to preventive and management oriented conservation. And here you have some answer why risk assessment is necessary at archaeological sites. And main factor is this exposed material, but also multi-material. Uh, we have a different stratigraphy and building. It's continuous changing, difficult to fully control, be honest, because if we have a archaeological site as a old Dongola, it's difficult to control every aspect of these buildings because we have ongoing archaeological works also. Also, it's affected by environmental and human pressure and manage under limited resources. And these limited resources is a very often main point when we are preparing a risk assessment that of course, we can have a great idea about it that we will sheltering all our sites by modern shelters, and it costs, I don't know, $5 million, but really often these resources are really limited, and we need to think about it, what we can make with limited money, for example. Mm, so this risk assessment helps identify, prioritize, justify intervention, support this long-term planning, reduced emergency responses, what is also really important. So before something happen, we can think about it and just have an answer for that. Improve allocation of resources and connect conservation and management. And also some key concept of risk assessment and important term in this case. So these are hazard, vulnerability, exposure, damage, risk, impact, probability, loss of value, and reversibility. An important principle in a risk assessment is that hazard alone do not create a risk. For example, rainfall is a natural environmental condition. The level of risk depends on vulnerability and exposure. The earthen wall without protective plaster, drainage, or maintenance may be highly vulnerable. A sheltered and maintained structure may face the same rainfall but experience much lower risk. These distinctions are important because conservation often cannot eliminate hazards. I cannot stop floods in Sudan or these rainfall events. So we need to work with that, and if we will prepare that it can happen, that we can figure out what we can do. So we can stop rain, wind, or temperature changes. What we can do is reduce vulnerability and exposure. This is why preventive conservation focuses so strongly on maintenance, shelters, drainage, monitoring, and environmental management. And values-based conservation is central to modern risk assessment. Because, like I said, two structures may suffer similar physical deterioration but represent completely different levels of heritage significance. A wall containing inscriptions, painting, or stratigraphic evidence may require much higher priority than a less significant structure. Similarly, a place with a religious or community importance may require different management decision than isolated ruin, and values therefore influence prioritization. This approach developed strongly through this organization, what I was talking about, methodologies, emphasis significance-based management. So this risk assessment without values becomes purely technical and may ignore what actually make heritage important. Sudanese archaeological sites are exposed to several interconnected risk categories, and here you have environmental risk, include rain, flooding, groundwater, salts, wind erosion, and thermal stress. And also I put as a different climate change related environmental instability. Also structural risk include instability, cracking, and collapse mechanism. And this human-related risk, so it's excavation, exposure, uncontrolled reconstruction, inappropriate repairs, vandalism. Sometimes it's also tourism pressure. In case of Sudan right now, it's also armed conflict, war, conflict-based damage. Abundant of exposed structures, and this reduced monitoring capacity. And here you have some examples of analyzing climate change risk in Sudan with causes, trends, and consequences, because it's also one of the most important Sudanese risks right now. And on the first place, we have a rising temperature, also sandstorms, this irregular rainfall and droughts, flash floods, which in last years are really strong, and it wasn't before like that, I think, but I will show you a table. The Aswan High Dam and Lake Nasser also have some influence of for a weather in Sudan, desertification and land degradation and extreme weather events. And I wanted to show you how you can analyze this kind of climate scenario in risk assessment. So here you have a climate analyzer website, and you can put, for example, Northern Sudan, and to find what will happen due to scenarios with a precipitation. With a precipitation is a really strange situation, because on this scheme you can see that in 50 years it will change. But when we will look at that as an annual one, also you can see a change. But if we will see at monthly analysis, then we can see that we have really extreme events during exact months, and these are even more dangerous than if it will be all time raining. And the same analysis you can make, of course, with a temperature. By this map, I wanted, this is a climate knowledge portal, and I recommend you to just check these websites and check what you can analyze due to these websites. And here you can see also a map that it's not like that in all Africa temperature is growing so fast. And in the case of Sudan, in the worst case, it will be bigger temperature, even more than 5, 6 degrees. And after this climate analysis, we can prepare it's a old Angola example, a table with climate hazards affecting our site, our building. And I decided to choose these extremely rainfall events. After that, we choose related secondary hazards because it's never like that we have only one hazard. Yeah, they are all together. After that, we can analyze worst case projection, uh, for example, in 100 years, a specific rational and rationate, and I put here a main sources of that. After that, we can go deeper and, for example, choose which structure are the most vulnerable for this kind of climate hazards and analyze step by step every building, every structure, and to think about it, which we should put in a top of our list to protect. Mm, one of the most important, sorry. Uh, oh, sorry, something happened, so I need to show you again my presentation. Sorry. Because right now you can't see a screen, yeah?
No, we
Okay.
don't see the screen.
Okay. So sorry for that once again. Uh, mhm. Sorry, we must do that like that. Because I started to drawing some lines on my screen and I was surprised and I wanted to check, do you see it? But I think it was just my mistake, sorry. Mm, so we are come back. Small technical break. Mm, so one of the most important developments in recent conservation thinking is a recognition that management failure is itself a conservation risk. A site may deteriorate not because of one catastrophic event, but because no maintenance system exists. Excavation season may expose remains and then leave them without follow-up care. And documentation may become fragmented or um, incasable, or monitoring may not exist. For example, conflict and post-conflict condition intensify these problems by weakening infrastructure and institutional continuity. And this is highly relevant in Sudanese heritage context. Mm, And here is a main slide of this risk assessment part, because this process can be organized into 6 practical stages. First is identify values. Second, identify hazards. Then identify vulnerabilities, access probability and impact. Fifth, prioritize. And finally, define mitigation strategies. And this structure is useful because it forces conservation teams to move logically from significance to action. And it also helps interdisciplinary teams communicate using this shared structure. Uh, Probability and impact are not always easy to uh, measure numeric by numbers at archaeological sites. Many assessments therefore combine a lot of methods, and important distinguish exist between sudden catastrophic risk and low cumulative risk. Collapse after heavy rain may be sudden, but salt accumulation may act slowly over years, while progressively weakening material. Slow risks are especially dangerous because they may become normalized and ignored. The assessment must therefore consider both speed and cumulative effect. And that's right, this prioritization is one of the most difficult part of a conservation. A risk assessment does not eliminate difficult decisions. It structures them. High value and high vulnerable elements usually receive higher priority. Irreversible losses require particular attention. However, uh, intervention must also remain realistic. Sometimes a low-cost maintenance action can reduce risk more effectively than expensive restoration campaign. This reflects the preventive conservation principle that management and maintenance are often more sustainable than repeated large-scale interventions. Mitigation strategies aim to reduce either hazard, vulnerability, shelter, reduce exposure to rain and sunlight. Mm, Sacrificial plasters protect vulnerable earthen or plastered surfaces, and monitoring protocols help detect change before severe damage develops, and maintenance schedules reduce cumulative deterioration. Visitor management reduce human-related risk. Importantly, the goal is not total elimination of risk. That is impossible. The goal is reduction of unacceptable loss while the maintaining realistic management capacity. Conservation is always practiced under constraints. So we have a budget, time, personal, material, and institutional capacity are limited. This means that prioritization is not optional, it's a part of responsible conservation planning. Emergency stabilization may be necessary where collapse or irreversible loss is imminent, but not every problem requires immediately treatment. In case of uncertainty, monitoring may be better than irreversible intervention. Mm, so documentation must be always precede intervention. And most important, a conservation decision is not sustainable if it can be maintained. A technical, impressive intervention that cannot be monitored, repaired, or managed may fail in long-term propositions. Mm, A practical prioritization logic can help teams decide what comes first. High value and high vulnerability usually create high priority. Active deterioration requires closer attention than stable damage. Irreversible loss must be treated seriously, and low cost and high impact actions should often be prioritized because they can reduce risk efficiently. However, any intervention must be linked to maintenance capacity. If delay will make later intervention more extensive or less effective, earlier action may be justified. And this approach prepares the transition to case study, Old Dongola, as a site where many different risks and values overlap. And now we can make a 15 minutes break, or you prefer to listen about Old Dongola and make a break later. It depends what you prefer.
I think we can have a 15 minutes break now. Or
Okay,
don't
great.
gonna need to focus, yeah.
Yeah, I know it was a lot of information, but Old Dongola will be with more photos and
Exactly. Okay.
Okay, see you at the 1 p.m. maybe?
yeah,
Yes, it's
right.
okay?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. You can see my screen, yeah? Mm. So, hello after coffee break. The first part of this lecture was more theoretical, but most of these sentences are really even extremely important for conservation and risk assessment. And I am a conservator, so I like to join these practical and theoretical parts. That's right, I decided to show you all the Dongola as an integrated risk landscape. So we moved to Old Dongola, where the first PCMA excavation began in 1964. Old Dongola, known in medieval times as a Tongul, lies on the east bank of the Nile. It was founded in the 5th century and soon became a capital of Nubian kingdom of Makuria. And for many centuries, it was a political, religious, and cultural heart of Christian Nubia. But importantly, after this period, the city also became a major religious and political center of Islam. Here you can see a map of this archaeological site. So we have a part of citadel and also part of a monastery. Mm, which you can see here. And old Dongola can be presented as integrated risk landscape because many of the issues discussed in the lecture. It is a multi-layered archaeological site with architecture, plasters, wall paintings, earthen materials, also brick structure and complex historical phases. Its conservation challenges cannot be reduced to one material or one risk. The site includes problem of exposure, salt, structural instability, open air preservation, maintenance, and relationship between excavation and long-term care. And this make it a strong case study for integrated conservation planning. Dongola is renowned for its wall paintings. So these churches, monastic complexes preserved a cycle with biblical narratives, depictions of saints, and it's combining and synthesis of a lot of cultural influence, and it makes it really unique because we have Byzantine, Coptic, and local African traditions in these paintings. And also different techniques. Here are examples of wall paintings from a citadel, where we have a B5 church with a lime plaster, and most of building are made by earthen mud plaster. And as you can imagine, such a large number of paintings is both exciting and overwhelming for conservators. And now I will present shortly some conservation project. Here we have one of the church where a conservation practice with cooperation with Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw almost every year are preparing, and some effects of these conservation treatments. So you can see a cleaning effects, also some putties in a wall, and we also made the structure of this mud plaster stronger, so it was some injection in this plaster. The other place where we have a conservation work is a citadel and this B5 church. So it's Archangel Raphael Church, where the situation is a little bit different because of different technology. It was this church was found a few years before this NB2 church, but there is really near to Nil this church, and we had some problems with the temperature inside because, as you see here, there is a roofing. So with this church is joined with a really important project if we are talking about risk assessment and planning. So it was the emergency protection of this church and roof replacement, because we decided to make a two-level roof to make a lower temperature and humidity inside. So one part of this roof is made by metal sheets, but the second layer, these are natural local products as muna and palm ribs. And then we have a situation that these walls can breathe and the temperature is lower inside. Other conservation project is Baraka revitalization of the oldest preserved Sudanese mosque at Old Dongola. And from a conservation point of view, we prepared some stratigraphic tests in this building to preparing it to renovation, but all project is a really holistic and multidisciplinary. So this is important part also that a conservation today is a collaboration. So for example, this mosque project is about collaboration with architect, constructors, archaeologists, and also main part of this project is a community engagement which prepared Tomomi. Like I said before, conservation, it can't be isolated, but even during this practical treatment, we need to talk with local communities and to think about it, what they want from this building. And this is example of documentation, which is also important part of this conservation works. And of course, archaeological works still ongoing. That's right. You have examples of ongoing archaeological works from 2023 when a huge apse was found with wall paintings. And 1 year later, a small room under a floor, which was excavated with wall paintings on a mud plaster. So you can imagine that in this case, a conservator which had the plans for different treatments, they need to prepare also for this kind of sudden unaccepted events. And in both of these cases, we decided to secondary backfilling by sand all of these two rooms because we decided that we don't have enough time for now for example, big roofing. So as you can see, conservators have a lot of works to do in Dongola, and it needs for a structured system. Conservation intervention have been carried out through all of these decades, and of course their role has been crucial. But right now we need to decide for conservation strategies. And for me, in these strategies, place number one is the documentation and analysis, and this is from what we are starting. After that, it's of course money, conservation project and grants, because not always with this archaeological project we have money for conservation. Also, these preventive conservation measures, and I was talking about it in the first part of this lecture, and sustainable and emergency response. So here you can see that conservation and archaeology, it's a single research process. And some assumption of this kind of conservation treatments in Old Dongola, for us, it's a integration, interdisciplinary, preventive approach, continuity and standardization, and also very important adaptation to our local conditions. First step in a conservation documentation is a description of a state of preservation, so-called condition assessment. We can make it in a different way, by photographic documentation, for example. So you have here this example for Old Dongola. And the main risk factors at Old Dongola includes those typical of exposed archaeological sites in Sudan. So this excavation creates exposure. Exposed materials respond to seasonal cycles, salts, winds, etc. Earthen and plastered surface are especially vulnerable. Mm, Structural instability may develop where walls, valued wall base, or excavated section loss them support. And of course, this open air presentation creates ongoing pressure because exposed remains must be survived between field seasons. Also, this is an example of documentation from a mosque where we don't need to have a painting on a wall to document a state of the preservation of this wall. And here, these are some specific plaster defects, but also inscription left by visitors, and it's really important to document it. Here, once again, example of a table of stratigraphic tests, how we can describe it. And one of my favorites, so mapping of damages, but also mapping of interventions. So this is very important for me, for future conservators, that they can, in a simple way, that they can see what we used and in which places. So if we have this kind of mapping, then it's a clear situation, because in a conservation, sometimes we are we have a different situation, and that we are used to that. For example, one material should works like that, but it works in a different way because it was a conservation treatments before. So it's really important to make this kind of mapping. But also it can be a simple scheme for a future, yeah? This is a slope documentation, and this is also what you can make in your sites, because you can try it on a Google Earth, and there is a because these schemes are from Google Earth, and then you can check what slopes are on this site and where exactly is your building, for example, and then you can start to think in the future that, for example, maybe if it will be heavy rains, then this part will be really damaged because of this rain, and you can try to think like that, okay, so firstly, we need to protect this place. And the final point is that Old Dongola requires not only individual conservation treatments, but a conservation care system. And such a system include documentation, condition assessment, monitoring, prioritization, which is really important, seasonal planning, emergency response, and interdisciplinary cooperation. These do not mean that every element must be treated immediately, because it's impossible. It means that the site must be understood, monitored, and managed as a whole. So risk assessment is the method that allows such a system to function. It helps identify what is most significant, what is most vulnerable and urgent, and what can be realistic, can be done. So in this case, I prepared some monitoring plan for Old Dongola to detect early environmental and material changes affecting the site. But this is something what we just started. But also in this kind of case, we need to have a plan. And here you have a climate risk mitigation and some adaptation strategy for Old Dongola, where firstly we can think about this short term. So this is immediate protection and monitoring, and the goal is to reduce immediate damage risk, collect real-time environmental data, and prepare site-wide adaptation design. But also as a conservator, architects, archaeologists, we need to think what will be later. So we have also a medium term and long term plan, where in a medium term, the goal will be combine heritage protection with sustainable landscape management and the public access. And even if we will start to think what will be in the next 100 years, so the goal then it will be ensure long-term survival, reinterpretation, and socio-cultural relevance of Old Dongola, even under this extreme climate scenario or other extreme scenario. Because we are after time, I think these are also maybe more like a homework for you that you can think about identify risks in this kind of situation, but already you said about it that, for example, it's a rain infiltration or a thermal stress. And also I have some question about risk and to choose some actions. So all of these things I think that we discuss, and here there is something what already happened, yeah, that did different specialists prioritize differently. Yes, of course, because we have a different point of view. And the most important case in this risk statement and conservation planning is a collaboration that we need to talk with other specialists and then choose together what way for us is the best. And there is just a scheme to show you that the conservation and conservation care system is not only just a conservation. It's archaeology, old art studies. In conservation, we have documentation, chemistry, also some biological science, chemical science, even environmental science. So it's a really, really big structure. And every time when we have this risk assessment or conservation planning, we need to think about different specialization also. And this final statement for me, so the most important that a risk statement is not an isolated administrative tool. I start from this and I think that we can conclusion like that. We need to understand a lot of parts of this archaeological site, materials, also deterioration process, all of these values type, impact and exposure, also this maintenance capacity, and our limitation that we can have a great vision, but sometimes we need to be a practical and to think about it, what we can really realize during, for example, one season. And thank you so much for this short discussion and that you had the energy to listen all of this all lecture. And this is my mail if you have any questions. Uh, we need to ask Tomomi, do we have a time for some questions? And also, like I said, this is a really huge, great topic. So I will prepare you a file with some dictionary, but not only about conservation and risk assessment. Thank you so much.